Hey everyone, Beast here. In today's video, we're once again going to explain very basic human rights to a group of people who seem to not understand them, namely Zionists, who don't understand the right to self-determination at all. The problem is that many seem to be kind of confused as to what it is for completely honest reasons on their part, and only happen to interpret it as giving one group more rights than another. I'll once again be responding to some videos and other forms of media where Zionists get the issue wrong. To get things started, though, what is the right to self-determination? Simply put, self-determination is an inalienable right, which all states are required to respect and which applies to all peoples, and by virtue of this right, peoples freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. To be clear, though, self-determination is not the right of every ethnic group on the planet to a state. This, to some extent, makes sense. Self-determination is a product of international law, which was created by states. Of the 190-plus states in the world, none of them want to lose territory. They believe in a state's right to territorial integrity, and thus they would never create a legal standard that allows people groups to have an unhindered right to secede from their state and take away sweet, juicy land. Rather, self-determination can be expressed in two forms: externally, where territory under occupation or colonial subjugation attempts to become free, or internally, where a people group remains within a state, but measures are taken so that they can pursue their rights. States can perhaps secede from other states where it is the only remedy for the violation of self-determination. In regards to the Palestinians, the right to self-determination is something which they are entitled to, as with all peoples. Concerning Palestine itself, this is a case of a state under occupation. As of now, Palestinians are ruled by Israel and are not able to practice their right to self-determination, where Israel has, among other things, instituted a regime of apartheid, undermined the territorial integrity of the occupied Palestinian territories, and violated Palestinians' right to movement. For Israel to fulfill its obligation to respect the right to self-determination of Palestinians, it would need to either end its occupation of all of the occupied Palestinian territories and ensure it allows Palestinians in its borders to be able to freely determine their political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, or it could possibly include the Palestinians from the occupied territories only with their consent, and only if the state respects the aforementioned rights. As mentioned, though, many argue against either of these options, and they usually base their rejection on the following arguments, which I will respond to throughout this video. 1. A right unique to Jews exists based on ancient title leading to a Jewish state over the entire land of Eretz Israel, as being the only form of self-determination which Jews can practice and which also supersedes Palestinians' right to self-determination. 2. Israel can curtail the right to self-determination for security reasons, aka the Arabs are scary argument. 3. Palestinians aren't a people group, and therefore the right to self-determination can be ignored. And 4. Palestinians never had a state in the past, and thus can't claim one now, appealing to the right of self-determination. Zionists tend to argue that Jewish people have ancient rights to all of Palestine, and that this gives them a unique right to a Jewish state. This is best exemplified by Israel's nation-state law, which states both that Jews have a unique right to self-determination and that settlement is a national priority. Benjamin Netanyahu, one of Israel's longest-serving prime ministers and the architect of this law, argues that
the Palestinians' connection to the land of Israel is nothing compared to the 4,000-year connection that the Jewish people have with the land.
He later stated, at a time when Israel was planning to formally declare its sovereignty over the West Bank, that
We have an opportunity that hasn't existed since 1948 to apply sovereignty in a wise way and as a diplomatic step in Judea and Samaria, and we will not let this opportunity pass.
As to what would happen to the Palestinians, Netanyahu proposed that they remain in small, isolated clusters as subjects and not citizens with rights. His coalition agreement is also explicit on this issue, with one of its guiding principles being that
the Jewish people have an exclusive and inalienable right over all areas of the land of Israel,
and also promising to apply sovereignty to the West Bank. This takes us to one of the videos which has tried to spread this line of thinking on YouTube. In a video titled "Free Palestine, No Thanks," YouTuber TravelingIsrael.com mirrors this kind of argument. He points to history, archaeological evidence of Jews living in the region from 3,000 years ago, saying,
"If you believe that God gave this land to the Jews, great. And if not, also great. The undeniable point is that there is a strong connection between the Jews and the land of Israel. There are thousands of books from the last 3,000 years that write about Jews and the land of Israel. And in archaeological digs, we find Jewish coins, Jewish texts, and Jewish artifacts. There isn't a single book or piece of archaeological evidence that points to a Palestinian people."
The point he is making by including this line is obvious, that the Palestinians don't have the same historical connection to the land as the Jewish people. I will note, however, that he often likes to pose as someone who supports a two-state solution, but I'm going to make the crazy leap that a guy who emphasized history from 2,000 years ago and then titled his video "Free Palestine, No Thanks" is actually against a Palestinian state and supports these ancient claims. If this isn't clear enough for you, he also has an entire other video titled "Why You Too Should Be Against a Palestinian State," an average Israeli opinion. Very subtle. Now, on his part, these are some highly provocative assertions, but surely he would understand the importance of sourcing his claims, especially since he's talking about history spanning millennia. No one on the internet would just say things without being willing to back them up, would they? Shock among shocks, no. He did not source anything he claimed, not a single link, and not a single book or anything. This section is not a takedown of his entire video, however. Just his and other Zionists' insistence that the right to sovereignty can be based on land claims going back several thousand years ago. Now, what does international law say about these sorts of claims? Well, luckily enough, a very similar case was made in the 1950s by France against Britain. France, still holding on to its century-long silliness vis-a-vis England, claimed the Minquiers and Ekrahos Islands. These islands are called islets and rocks in the decision. They are so small you can't even find them on Google Maps. But it was apparently such an important issue that England and France needed to go to the highest court in the world, the International Court of Justice. And they ruled that you can't make claims of sovereignty based on title from hundreds of years ago, saying,
"Even if the kings of France did have an original feudal title also in respect to the Channel Islands, such a title must have lapsed as a consequence of the events of the year 1204 and following years. Such an alleged original feudal title of the kings of France in respect of the Channel Islands could, today, produce no legal effect unless it had been replaced by another title valid according to the law of the time of replacement."
It's worth noting that this is a claim to sovereignty going back to 800 years ago, whereas in the Zionist case, their claim to the entire land of historic Palestine is based on title extinguished from 2,000 years ago, which is even older. In short, it doesn't matter which ethnic group had sovereignty over land 800 or even 2,000 years ago. It has no effect on the right to self-determination at all. As mentioned, it's an inalienable right, however the borders are drawn up. Hopefully, this makes sense. The example of France and its silly appeal to a feudal title and the Zionist emphasis on some coins aren't the only time these kind of moronic claims are made. For instance, Russia under Putin claims a historical connection to Kiev because a polity called the Kievan Rus held on to the city in the 9th century. The idea that this would confer title over Kiev to the Russian state would get you laughed out of town, unless you are on the same payroll as Tim Pool. It's the same in this instance. Zionists also tend to argue something to the effect of Palestinians are dangerous, culturally backwards people who just want to do evil, nasty things for no explicable reason. You'll see politicians like Netanyahu argue that Palestinians shouldn't have a state based on security reasons, saying, after a wave of European states recognize Palestine, by the way, that
this will be a terrorist state. It will try to repeatedly carry out the massacre of October 7, and we will not agree to that.
This traveling Israel guy also makes this argument, but takes it to an insane degree, saying,
I believe you can criticize anyone for anything. You can criticize me as a Jew, as an Israeli, as a man, as a tour guide. You can criticize me for things I can't change, like my identity.
It might surprise you all to hear this, but I don't think you should criticize people for their immutable characteristics. There's no legitimate criticism of anyone that is based on them being a Jew or an Arab or whatever race or creed. I'm also going to go out on a limb here and say that most Jews wouldn't appreciate being criticized for being Jewish, and for good reason. Later, he goes on to argue that Palestinians have scary values and they will inevitably resort to violence against Israel because of these values. Now, disregarding the fact that Israel has itself engaged in several massacres, attacks on civilians, and sexual violence, and in turn disregarding what implications using the logic of these people this might have on Israelis' right to self-determination, can security concerns be used to justify denying people their right to self-determination? The short answer is no. The right to self-determination is inalienable. The ICJ has recently held that
Israel's measures imposing restrictions on all Palestinians solely on account of their Palestinian identity are disproportionate to any legitimate public aim and cannot be justified with reference to security.
And, when asked to consider to
ascertain whether the exercise of the right to self-determination by the Palestinian people has infringed the territorial integrity, political inviolability, or legitimate security needs of the State of Israel.
the court didn't consider this relevant to the question of the right to self-determination at all. I hope this makes sense. All countries to some extent have security concerns based on the threat posed by a neighbor. Palestinians have legitimate security concerns in relation to Israel, and Israel has legitimate security concerns relating to Palestine. This can't be a basis for violating human rights, because these security concerns are aimed in every direction and are concerns for every country. Taking this to the extreme, the right to self-determination of all peoples in the world can be denied if this argument is accepted. I've decided to combine these next two arguments because they are very similar in nature. These arguments consist of saying either that Palestinians are not a people and thus the right to self-determination does not apply to them, or that Palestinians never had a state and therefore should not have one now. For example, Zionists like Israel's finance minister Bezalel Smotrich believe that there is no such thing as a Palestinian because there is no such thing as the Palestinian people, and that the Palestinian people is an invention that is less than 100 years old. And in Traveling Israel's video, why you too should be against a Palestinian state, an average Israeli opinion, he in turn emphasizes this as a part of his argument.
Let's talk about the so-called Palestinians. When the British came here at the end of World War I, they basically invented two nations, the Jordanians and the Palestinians. Two nations that never existed before. It is very easy to prove that. Name a Palestinian leader before Arafat, or show me a Palestinian coin. What were the borders of this land?
And that over 3,000 years, no pilgrim ever reported to or seeing a Palestinian. Now, I can tackle these issues the easy way, which is pointing to the case law, which just explicitly affirms my point. For example, the ICJ has ruled that Palestinians are people, and whether they had a state or not thousands of years ago was never at any point held to be relevant in discussing the right to self-determination. You can take a look at the decision there if you want to give that a look-see. But I'll take it to another level and explain both why Palestinians are a people and whether they had a state in the past is irrelevant. Under international law, there is not a solidified definition of peoplehood. Sometimes it's used basically as a synonym for population. Other times it's based on whether there is a certain degree of community based on race, language, religion, or culture. Other characteristics can include a consciousness of identity and a will to exist. It is less a definition and more a list of characteristics that a group of people generally must fall into. Either way, Palestinians do clearly have a degree of community based in language and culture. Race and religion in Palestine is very diverse, however, and at this point, it is undeniable that Palestinians are conscious of a Palestinian identity and have a will to exist. This can be seen in the numerous Palestinian cultural and political institutions. It's kind of stupid to even discuss this because the courts consider Palestinian peoplehood to be such a non-issue that they barely discuss it, and even Israel under Oslo recognizes that the Palestinian people exist. Lastly, we ought to deal with the relevance of whether a Palestinian state existing 1,000, 2,000, or 3,000 years ago has concerning today. As mentioned, the court doesn't consider this relevant at all. This is because self-determination is an inalienable right. Many states and peoples that exist today can't draw a historical connection to polities from the extremely distant past. There's no reason to use this to deny people human rights. It's not a valid reason to deny people the right to self-determination. In the Palestinian case, this can only be realized in two ways. One, Israel leaves the occupied Palestinian territories and allows it to begin self-governance while also respecting its obligations to Palestinians within its borders. Or two, they incorporate the occupied territories with the consent of the Palestinian population while also ensuring it respects the right to self-determination. Many of you might have noticed I spent more time rebutting these arguments using the principles of human rights rather than tackle the assortment of bogus claims these people make. In part, this is because the videos I'm responding to don't have very coherently constructed arguments, and there's not much of a link between the claims he makes and his general point. At no point does he make the effort to explain why, for example, archaeological evidence from thousands of years ago logically leads to why millions of Palestinians today shouldn't have a state. But most importantly, I didn't want to acknowledge his way and the way that many Zionists, for that matter, view the rights of peoples. I don't think it's valid. I think it would make the world an actively worse place if we think like they do. Whether the claims they assert, which in this instance were not sourced, are true is irrelevant if the argument is based on principles that are illogical and unjust. And for all of the valid critiques you can have of international law, it is clear that they do more to advance human rights than the principles undergirding Zionism, and thus I won't construct an argument that is even slightly based on assuming, well, even if that principle is right, when it's not. Simply put, this is not how we should treat human beings. This is the part of the video where I thank everybody who contributed. So I just want to start off by saying a big thank you to Ravignon. She really stepped in, and I lost my pen for my Wacom tablet, so I couldn't draw the thumbnail. And she, really helped me out in a pinch and gave this really hilarious thumbnail. So big thanks to her. I also want to thank everybody who voiced for this video, including We Are in Hell, Things That I Care About, and Chill Goblin. Thank you guys so much for lending your voice to this video. And but forget about all those people, because what really matters are the people who give me money. Thank you so much to the patrons. $7 and up patrons get their names read out at the end of the video, and I really appreciate your help in making these videos possible. So big thank you to Avocado Kirby, Clado, Plum, Rod B, Pyrotic Napalm, and Timg. Thank you so much. Have a good night.